what should the launch of your no-code app actually look like? If you are planning to launch a no-code app and you learn or watch anything today, make it this, because the way you launch can affect your ultimate success and the outcome you see with your app. And so you want to get this right. And we are going to do a deep dive into this today to talk about what your app should actually look like when you have your first launch versus what it should look like as you progress and as you continue to roll out the app. Now, make sure you stick around until the end, because while we're focusing on the launch in this video, at the end, we're going to take a step back and talk about how you can actually start correctly in order to make your way towards this type of launch. So stick around for that. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build app-based businesses or apps to help them scale their existing businesses with no tech background or coding required. So what we're going to do today is go over 5 key aspects to keep in mind when you're launching, or 5 key factors, so that you can have a successful launch and move into truly being able to grow and scale your app and your business. Now, we're going to use the example of an app that everybody knows about, Twitter, and we're going to actually kind of analyze how Twitter launched and how Twitter sort of evolved over the years. And we're going to pull some lessons from this so that you can apply those to your own app. Now, it doesn't matter what type of app you're building. It's okay if you're not building a social media app. It's okay if you are building a business-related app. Whatever it is, these lessons will apply. So that's what we're going to do. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen here so that we can actually get an inside look. So on the screen here, I have Twitter, today's Twitter, pulled up. This is what one of Twitter's landing pages, their about page, looks like, right? It's very sleek, number one. And also you can see on their about page that they have things like principles. They have core values here. They have, things that they stand for, lots of great design. They talk about their team, their leadership, all of these different things. Now, the reason why I wanted to start on this page is because a lot of people, when they're building their no-code apps, they look at things like this as examples, inspiration for what they should be doing. But instead of looking at things like this as examples of inspiration of what they should eventually work towards, they look at these as things they should be doing now before they've ever even had their first launch. And so, there's a very sleek design on Twitter's landing pages, but design aside, things like having established company values and all of the branding and everything like that, it's not something that happens now. Now we're going to go a lot deeper into features of your app and things like that too, but I wanted to start out here because this is usually what people see and aspire to, but they aspire to this way too early, before they've ever had their first launch. And so that's the first thing that I want you to keep in mind. Now, what I have here is actually a few tabs pulled up. So one, we have a Bustle article that talks about what Twitter used to look like, okay, from when they very first launched up until now. We also have a timeline of Twitter updates, or actually a couple of timelines of Twitter updates, so that we can actually look at the features. So strategically, how should you be releasing new features for your app? When should you be maybe looking at new markets or new user types? Things like that. Okay, so looking at this Bustle article, Twitter was initially founded in 2006. Okay, so it's been around for a while, and there have been lots of opportunities for them to grow and evolve. And in fact, if you look at this screenshot right here, in July 2015, 2006, Twitter is introduced to the public. Now, if you've used Twitter, or if you've ever seen any sort of reference to Twitter anywhere, then it doesn't look like this, okay? Now, a lot of the entrepreneurs who I speak with, and even the ones who we work with, they want to launch looking like the apps they use. But remember, if you are using an app on a day-to-day basis, chances are it has already had time to evolve to the point where you are using it and finding it valuable on a consistent basis. Maybe you're paying for it, and that means the app has evolved, the company, the features, the design, everything. But remember that evolution has to happen over time. And if Twitter can be at the point it's at today, and it looked like this in the very beginning, that again, that should just drive home the fact that this evolution has to happen over time. Okay, we don't even have the same name here, right? We're looking at a completely different design. Like, this is clearly very, very basic. And it doesn't look anything like Twitter as it is today. Okay, so keep this in mind as a good example. And scrolling down, even the user interaction here, right? This looks completely different. And this is something that a lot of people have a hard time launching with. Base functionality like this, a usable design meaning, look, you can actually use an app that looks like this, or you can use a feed that looks like this. The rows are different colors to help you differentiate. It's usable. It's not aesthetically pleasing, but look at how they launched. It's a usable design. It's a usable app. And a lot of people want to launch with the prettiest, fanciest app they can possibly imagine, but it doesn't lead to early success usually, because it's hard to achieve something like that in a short amount of time and actually be able to launch. Okay, so use that as an example. Now, we won't go through every single year, but as we scroll down, you can see little changes in the name, changes in the coloring, the branding, right? The design, changes in the layout, changes with some of the functionality, right? Look, the first hashtag is created in 2007. Okay, so my reason for wanting to show you this is to, again, drive home the fact that evolution happens over time. If you try to have a fully evolved app that you are launching for the first time, you are going to struggle. So with that in mind, I want to get into these 5 different factors that should play into your launch. Things you need, things you don't need, things that you really just should be thinking about as you're working towards your very first launch. So if we go over here to a timeline of Twitter updates, now this is on HubSpot's blog. It starts out in 2008 down here, and we're going to do some scrolling up to look at the different evolutions. But one of the things that I want to point out here is that in 2009, in July of 2009, Twitter launches Twitter 101, a special guide for businesses. Now, the reason why this is important is because your initial launch should really be focused on one core market or one key market. Today, people use Twitter for business. People use Twitter for entertainment, just in their personal lives. But that wasn't always the case. And I see a lot of people trying to launch the very first version of their app and making it already cater to different markets. Now, this is different than a marketplace app where you have 2 sides, right? I'm talking about completely different markets where, someone using Twitter just to share updates with their friends is a completely different market than someone using Twitter to promote their business. Twitter did not launch already offering the capability for businesses to promote themselves using Twitter. Now, Twitter launched for personal consumer use, right? And so this evolution happened over time. And I see this happen a lot with people. They want to hit on all these different markets where they think their app could be helpful, and they want to do it with their first launch. But you have to learn how your app can be helpful, how your app could potentially serve another market, but you have to serve one market first successfully. Now, the other thing I want to show you here, we're going to switch over to Wikipedia. So this is another just basic timeline. Now, in early March of 2006, okay, the name Twitter, spelled TWTTR, is chosen for the service. So in 2006, Twitter was not spelled in the same way that Twitter is spelled today. Now, this is important because all too often I see entrepreneurs working towards their very first launch, obsessing over their app's name, their company's name, their URL, their logo, their branding, all of this. And it holds them back from actually being able to launch. So if you look at the way Twitter launched, yes, their name was spoken in the same way, but spelled completely differently. You know, they changed, they evolved, and that was okay. Just because they evolved or just because they had to make a big change like that didn't mean that their business went under. And I think that's the fear that a lot of people have, is if they don't launch perfectly, if they don't launch with the perfect name, with the perfect URL, with the perfect branding and logo, that, you know, they're going to find it needs to change at some point, and it's just going to be this devastating blow to their app's scale and to their business. And that's just not the case. It's just not. I mean, we changed our company's name. We changed our URL. This happens all the time, right? We've changed our branding. We've changed our logo. And Twitter is the same, and so many other companies are the same too. So if you're spending time obsessing on that and trying to get it perfect before your first launch, know that you can't get it perfect. You just can't, because you don't have the feedback you need yet. You don't have interaction with your market. You just can't. That evolution, again, happens over time. So don't let it hold you back before you ever actually launch in the first place. Okay, now another thing that I want to show you here on Wikipedia is in September of 2006, right? It says Twitter attempts to have a grand launch at the Love Parade, but gets very little traction here with only 100 signups. Now, this is important because in a lot of people's minds, a launch has to be big and it has to be perfect, or else the app is not successful. Okay, so a lot of people who actually have their launches, if their initial launch isn't successful, they'll think that the app is just, you know, maybe it's just not a good idea after all. Maybe they shouldn't be building it. Maybe they should just call it quits and turn to something else. And again, before launching, a lot of people think they have to have this kind of like grand opening where it's a big launch, where they have to generate a ton of buzz. And I wanted to pull this out here because Twitter tried to have a grand launch and it didn't go as planned. Okay, it just wasn't successful, but Twitter is successful. And that's because they persisted. Number one, just because they didn't have a successful big launch this one time didn't mean that they couldn't try to continue launching, right? They couldn't try to continue their user outreach. It wasn't a sign that Twitter is just a bad idea. It was just a sign that that one launch wasn't executed as it should be. So, hey, let's go back to the drawing board and figure out how we can do it better the next time. If trying to plan this massive launch is something that's adding time onto your overall development time frame, it's keeping you from actually being able to launch sooner, just remember this: you don't need a grand opening in order to be successful. Okay, now looking at, let's scroll down to December of 2011. It says here that Twitter overhauls its website once more to feature the fly design. Now, we won't go into the specifics of this overhaul, but what I want to highlight is once more. Twitter overhauls its website once more. If you are trying to launch with the perfect design, the perfect set of features, absolute perfection, because you are afraid that users won't like it if it's not perfect, okay? You're never going to launch. That's just the reality. You're never going to launch because your app can't ever be perfect. And if you have that mindset where you're trying to make it perfect, then you have the wrong mindset altogether anyways, because you should always be evolving your app. If you're finished with your app, then you're failing, really, because you should always be pushing to evolve. Okay, but the lesson I want to pull out from this is that once more, in 2011 now, Twitter overhauls its website. Okay, overhauls, those are going to happen. I think the word overhaul, it's like a dirty word in a lot of people's minds when they're trying to build their apps, because they fear it, because of the amount of work it might take, or because if you're putting all this work in now, you don't want to get to the point where you have to overhaul. Doesn't that mean you've wasted all your time? No, the only reason Twitter overhauled is because they actually launched in the first place. They brought users on board and they started listening and getting feedback and learning how to make the app better. An overhaul is a natural point in the path of growth. Okay, if you are not overhauling at any point within the lifetime of your business, then you're probably not doing a very good job of intaking feedback or focusing on the right priorities. So don't be afraid of that. Don't let that fear hold you back from launching early just because you're trying to make the app perfect, right? Your launch, it cannot be made up of data and facts because you don't have those yet. You don't have the data, you don't have the trends, you can't analyze anything until you've actually launched in the first place. Okay, your launch is going to be made up of assumptions early on, and that's okay. They should be validated assumptions, meaning, if you are putting time, energy, effort, money into launching an app, then ideally, you have a reason for building the app. But ultimately, your first launch is just made up of assumptions. Okay, if your idea is validated, but you haven't validated your product yet, or how people are going to implement it into their lives or their businesses or their processes. Your first launch can't be made up of facts, right? It's going to be made up of assumptions. And let this example here of Twitter overhauling its website once more in 2011 be proof of that for you, okay? Now, the fifth thing, so we're at 4 now, the fifth thing that I want to highlight here happens in 2010. So actually, we're going to go back down. June of 2010 here. So we're back to the HubSpot blog, this timeline. It says, Twitter adds more context to tweets with Twitter places. Okay. Now, the reason I want to show you this, and we'll kind of scroll up from here and see a little bit more of this, is that in 2010, Twitter is still adding more features, new features. And if we scroll up here, we can keep seeing this, right? Twitter rolls out analytics tool. Twitter starts displaying promoted tweets. Twitter introduces changes to users' timelines. Twitter launches brand pages. I mean, look at all the different features and different components that they're launching over time. I mean, in 2012, launching a new ad API. I mean, it continues. It still continues, right? But my point in showing you this evolution in features is because your feature set for your first launch should focus on solving one core problem, okay? Can you imagine if Twitter had tried to launch their very first launch for the very first time as Twitter as it exists today, with all of these features, all of these capabilities? Can you imagine it? I mean, really think about that. There would be no launch. It wouldn't happen. There's just no way. We're looking at, all the way back to 2006. There's just no way. You need to have your first launch focused on solving the first core problem your target market has, not every problem that you could possibly think of. And a lot of people go outside of just looking at solving problems, but really just start thinking of all the cool features they add. And what I see a lot of people doing is, and the reason why we're looking at an app like Twitter right now is because they will look at all the features that something like Twitter has, or again, Airbnb, Asana, Trello, whatever it is. I'll look at all those features and think, well, if I'm going to launch an app, then I need to have more, right? That's the mindset that a lot of people have. If you have that mindset, you're probably never going to launch. It's just too hard. There's just too much. Think about if your first launch is ultimately made up of assumptions, right? Think about trying to launch a product that's as big as Twitter is today, which again, a lot of people aim to do. Every single one of those things would be assumptions. Look at this list, right? That would be a lot of assumptions. Can you imagine, number one, building all of that out before ever launching, before ever seeing any type of return on the investment that you're putting in? Can you imagine testing that? Oh my gosh, if you've started building your app yet and you've run into issues or errors and you've had to do testing and troubleshooting, can you imagine trying to test and troubleshoot after you have somehow spent, years of time building an app this big? Oh my gosh. It's not realistic. Can you imagine even bringing users on board and getting feedback on that many features? And can you imagine even trying to implement that feedback? It just doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. And so I want you to use these lessons, okay? Use this type of example to help you understand what you should be launching and what you shouldn't be launching. What your first launch should really look like. It shouldn't be perfect, right? It should focus on a core market, not all the different markets that you think might find your app helpful, right? Your branding, your URL, even your app's name, those can change and it's not going to put you under. It's not going to devastate you. Those are just things that happen. So don't try to get them perfect before your first launch, because if you do, chances are they're going to change anyways. And so all that extra time will just be wasted when you otherwise could have been helping your users solve their problems and getting good feedback, okay? You don't need that big grand opening. You just don't, because chances are you're going to still need to optimize after your first launch anyways, right? That's what happened with Twitter. They realized that their first launch didn't work. So they had to figure out how to do it differently, how to do it better. And that's something that you should just assume. And if you go into it with that mindset, you're going to have a heck of an easier time actually launching in the first place. But remember to be persistent. Just because the first launch doesn't go well, if that happens, well, that doesn't mean that people don't want or need your app. It means you need to figure out how to launch differently or better, right? And your launch, it's going to be made up of assumptions the first time around, educated assumptions, but assumptions all the same. You can't start getting the data, the analytics, the trends, all the feedback, the facts, really, until you bring users on board. But those are the things that are going to help you scale your app and your company. So your aim should be on getting those, right? Not on getting it perfect, but on getting that feedback, on getting those trends and being able to pull trends, right? And remember that your features, the feature set that you have in your first launch, they should solve one core problem, not every problem you could possibly think of. Because if you do that, then you probably will never actually launch, right? I've unfortunately seen that happen more times than I would like to, but it's just this trap where it's a mindset thing. It's like, you see other apps with all these features, so you feel like if I don't launch with more, then nobody's going to want my app. right? But it's just not realistic to do that. And it's not helpful for you. So your first launch should be about getting feedback. That's your goal. Get the feedback. Because if you've done that, that means that you are focusing on a core feature set. You're focusing on a core user type. You're focusing on a core market, a core problem, a core outcome, right? Core being the key word. The evolution happens over time, but the evolution can't happen unless you have launched. Okay, so remember that. Now, I said that we would look back to how to get started correctly so you can work your way towards this launch. So we have a workshop. It's at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop that walks you through the initial stages of planning a roadmap that will help guide you towards the type of launch that we've talked about. So this roadmap is specifically to help you be able to launch earlier, to launch with the right features, to launch to the right user, all these things we've talked about. So if you go through that workshop, then you're going to be able to put together a roadmap. And if you follow that roadmap, then you're going to be able to aim towards this type of launch, which will enable you, again, to start getting that early feedback to actually get your app out there and growing it from there. That's the only way it's going to happen. So you can head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop for that. All right. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.